Chapter 46. Windy. Around noon, after Danny had gone into the bathroom to use the toilet, Windy took the towel-wrapped knife from under her pillow, put it in the pocket of her bathrobe, and went over to the bathroom door.
Danny? What? I'm going down to make us some lunch, okay? Okay. You want me to come down? No, I'll bring it up. How about a cheese omelet and some soup? Sure.
She hesitated outside the closed door a moment longer.
Danny, are you sure it's okay? Yeah. Just be careful. Where's your father? Do you know?
His voice came back curiously flat.
No, but it's okay.
She stifled an urge to keep asking, to keep picking around the edges of the thing. The thing was there. They knew what it was. Picking at it was only going to frighten Danny more. And herself. Jack had lost his mind. They had sat together on Danny's cot as the storm began to pick up clout and meanness around 8 o'clock this morning, and had listened to him downstairs, bellowing and stumbling from one place to another. Most of it had seemed to come from the ballroom. Jack singing tuneless bits of song, Jack holding up one side of an argument, Jack screaming loudly at one point, freezing both of their faces as they stared into one another's eyes. Finally, they had heard him stumbling back across the lobby, and Windy thought she heard a loud banging noise, as if he had fallen down or pushed a door violently open. Since 8:30 or so, 3.5 hours now, there had been only silence. She went down the short hall, turned into the main first-floor corridor, and went to the stairs. She stood on the first-floor landing, looking down into the lobby. It appeared deserted, but the gray and snowy day had left much of the long room in shadow. Danny could be wrong. Jack could be behind a chair or couch, maybe behind the registration desk, waiting for her to come down. She wet her lips.
Jack?
No answer. Her hand found the handle of the knife, and she began to go down. She had seen the end of her marriage many times, in divorce, in Jack's death at the scene of a drunken car accident, a regular vision in the dark 2 o'clock of Stovington mornings, and occasionally in daydreams of being discovered by another man, a soap opera Galahad, who would sweep Danny and her into the saddle of his snow-white charger and take them away. But she had never envisioned herself prowling halls and staircases like a nervous felon, with a knife clasped in one hand to use against Jack. A wave of despair struck through her at the thought, and she had to stop halfway down the stairs, holding the railing, afraid her knees would buckle.
Admit it, it's just Jack. No, it isn't just Jack. He's just the one solid thing in all of this you can hang the other things on. The things you can't believe and yet are being forced to believe. That thing about the hedges, the party favor in the elevator, the mask. She tried to stop the thought, but it was too late. And the voices. Because from time to time, it had not seemed that there was a solitary crazy man below them, shouting at and holding conversations with the phantoms in his own crumbling mind. From time to time, like a radio signal fading in and out, she had heard, or thought she had, other voices and music and laughter.
At one moment, she would hear Jack holding a conversation with someone named Grady. The name was vaguely familiar to her, but she made no actual connection. Making statements and asking questions into silence, yet speaking loudly, as if to make himself heard over a steady background racket. And then, eerily, other sounds would be there, seeming to slip into place. A dance band, people clapping, a man with an amused yet authoritative voice, who seemed to be trying to persuade somebody to make a speech. For a period of 30 seconds to a minute, she would hear this, long enough to grow faint with terror, and then it would be gone again, and she'd only hear Jack, talking in that commanding yet slightly slurred way she remembered as his drunk-speak voice. But there was nothing in the hotel to drink except cooking sherry. Wasn't that right? Yes, but if she could imagine that the hotel was full of voices and music, couldn't Jack imagine that he was drunk? She didn't like that thought. Not at all. Wendy reached the lobby and looked around. The velvet rope that had cordoned off the ballroom had been taken down. The steel post it had been clipped to had been knocked over, as if someone had carelessly bumped it going by. Mellow white light fell through the open door into the lobby rug from the ballroom's high, narrow windows. Heart-thumping, she went to the open ballroom doors and looked in. It was empty and silent. The only sound that curious subaural echo that seems to linger in all large rooms, from the largest cathedral to the smallest hometown bingo parlor. She went back to the registration desk and stood undecided for a moment, listening to the wind howl outside. It was the worst storm so far, and it was still building up force. Somewhere on the west side, a shutter latch had broken, and the shutter banged back and forth with a steady, flat cracking sound, like a shooting gallery with only one customer.
Jack, you really should take care of that before something gets in.
What would she do if he came at her right now, she wondered. If he should pop up from behind the dark, varnished registration desk with its pile of triplicate forms and its little silver-plated bell, like some murderous jack-in-the-box, pun intended. A grinning jack-in-the-box with a cleaver in one hand and no sense at all left behind his eyes. Would she stand frozen with terror? Or was there enough of the primal mother in her to fight him for her son until one of them was dead? She didn't know. The very thought made her sick. It made her feel that her whole life had been a long and easy dream to lull her helplessly into this waking nightmare. She was soft. When trouble came, she slept. Her past was unremarkable. She had never been tried in fire. Now the trial was upon her. Not fire, but ice. And she would not be allowed to sleep through this. Her son was waiting for her upstairs. Clutching the haft of the knife tighter, she peered over the desk. Nothing there. Her relieved breath escaped her in a long, hitching sigh. She put the gate up and went through, pausing to glance into the inner office before going in herself. She fumbled through the next door for the bank of kitchen light switches, coldly expecting a hand to close over hers at any second. Then the fluorescents were coming on with a minuscule ticking and humming sounds, and she could see Mr. Halloran's kitchen. Her kitchen now, for better or worse. Pale green tiles, gleaming formica, spotless porcelain, glowing chrome edgings. She had promised him that she would keep his kitchen clean, and she had. She felt as if it was one of Danny's safe places. Dick Halloran's presence seemed to enfold and comfort her. Danny had called for Mr. Halloran, and upstairs, sitting next to Danny in fear as her husband ranted and raved below. That had seemed like the faintest of all hopes. But standing here in Mr. Halloran's place, it seemed almost possible. Perhaps he was on his way now, intent on getting to them regardless of the storm. Perhaps it was so. She went across to the pantry, shot the bolt back, and stepped inside. She got a can of tomato soup and closed the pantry door again and bolted it. The door was tied against the floor. If you kept it bolted, you didn't have to worry about rat or mouse droppings in the rice or flour or sugar. She opened the can and dropped the slightly jellied contents into a saucepan. Plop. She went to the refrigerator and got milk and eggs for the omelet. Then to the walk-in freezer for cheese. All of these actions, so common and so much a part of her life before the Overlook had been a part of her life, helped to calm her. She melted butter in the frying pan, diluted the soup with milk, and then poured the beaten eggs into the pan. A sudden feeling that someone was standing behind her, reaching for her throat. She wheeled around, clutching the knife. No one there. Get a hold of yourself, girl. She grated a bowl of cheese from the block, added it to the omelet, flipped it, and turned the gas ring down to a bare blue flame. The soup was hot. She put the pot on the large tray with silverware, 2 bowls, 2 plates, the salt and pepper shakers. When the omelet had puffed slightly, Wendy slid it off onto one of the plates and covered it. Now back the way you came. Turn off the kitchen lights, go through the inner office, through the desk gate, collect $200. She stopped on the lobby side of the registration desk and set the tray down beside the silver bell. Unreality would stretch only so far. This was like some surreal game of hide and seek. She stood in the shadowy lobby, frowning in thought. And don't push the facts away this time, girl. There are certain realities, as lunatic as this situation may seem. One of them is that you may be the only responsible person left in this grotesque pile. You have a 5 going on 6 son to look out for. And your husband, whatever has happened to him, and no matter how dangerous he may be, maybe he's part of your responsibility too. And even if he isn't, consider this. Today is December 2nd. You can be stuck up here another 4 months if a ranger doesn't happen by. Even if they do start to wonder why they haven't heard from us on the CB, no one's gonna come today. Or tomorrow. Maybe not for weeks. Are you gonna spend a month sneaking down to get meals with a knife in your pocket and jumping at every shadow? Do you really think you can avoid Jack for a month? Do you think you can keep Jack out of the upstairs quarters if he wants to get in? He has the pass key on, and one hard kick would snap the bolt. Leaving the tray on the desk, she walked slowly down to the dining room and looked in. It was deserted. There was one table with the chairs set up around it, the table they had tried eating at until the dining room's emptiness began to freak them out. "Jack?" she called hesitantly. At that moment, the wind rose in a gust, driving snow against the shutters, but it seemed to her that there had been something, a muffled sort of groan. "Jack?" No returning sound this time, but her eyes fell on something beneath the bat-wing doors of the Colorado Lounge. Something that gleamed faintly in the subdued light. Jack's cigarette lighter. Plucking up her courage, she crossed to the bat-wings and pushed them open. The smell of gin was so strong that her breath snagged in her throat. It wasn't even right to call it a smell. It was a positive reek. But the shelves were empty. Where in God's name had he found it? A bottle hidden at the back of one of the cupboards? Where? There was another groan, low and fuzzy, perfectly audible this time. Wendy walked slowly to the bar.
Jack?
No answer. She looked over the bar, and there he was, sprawled out on the floor in a stupor, drunk as a lord by the smell. He must have tried to go right over the top and lost his balance. A wonder he hadn't broken his neck. An old proverb recurred to her. God looks after drunks and little children. Amen. Yet she was not angry with him. Looking down at him, she thought he looked like a horribly overtired little boy who had tried to do too much and had fallen asleep in the middle of the living room floor. He had stopped drinking, and it was not Jack who had made the decision to start again. There had been no liquor for him to start with, so where had it come from? Resting at every 5 or 6 feet along the horseshoe-shaped bar, there were wine bottles wrapped in straw, their mouths plugged with candles, supposed to look bohemian, she supposed. She picked one up and shook it, half expecting to hear the slosh of gin inside it. New wine in old bottles. But there was nothing. She set it back down. Jack was stirring. She went around the bar, found the gate, and walked back on the inside to where Jack lay, pausing only to look at the gleaming chromium taps. They were dry, but when she passed close to them, she could smell beer, wet and new, like a fine mist. As she reached Jack, he rolled over, opened his eyes, and looked up at her. For a moment his gaze was utterly blank, and then it cleared. "Wendy?" he asked. "That you?"
Yes, she said. Do you think you can make it upstairs? If you put your arms around me? Jack, where did you...
His hand closed brutally around her ankle.
Jack, what are you...
"Gotcha," he said, and began to grin. There was a stale odor of gin and olives about him that seemed to set off an old terror in her. A worse terror than any hotel could provide by itself. A distant part of her thought. The worst thing was that it had all come back to this. She and her drunken husband.
Jack, I want to help.
Oh, yeah. You and Danny only want to help. The grip on her ankle was crushing now. Still holding on to her, Jack was getting shakily to his knees. You wanted to help us all right out of here. But now, I gotcha.
Jack, you're hurting my ankle.
I'll hurt more than your ankle, you bitch. The word stunned her so completely that she made no effort to move when he let go of her ankle and stumbled from his knees to his feet, where he stood swaying in front of her. You never loved me. You want us to leave because you know that'll be the end of me. Did you ever think about my responsibilities? No, I guess to fuck you didn't. All you ever think about is ways to drag me down. You're just like my mother, you milksop bitch.
Stop it, she said, crying. You don't know what you're saying. You're drunk. I don't know how, but you're drunk.
Oh, I know. I know now. You and him, that little pup upstairs, the two of you planning together. Isn't that right?
No. We never planned anything. What are you...
You liar. Oh, I know how you do it. I guess I know that. When I say, we're gonna stay here and I'm gonna do my job, you say, yes, dear. And he says, yes, Daddy. And then you lay your plans. You plan to use the snowmobile. You plan that. But I knew. I figured it out. Did you think I wouldn't figure it out? Did you think I was stupid? She stared at him, unable to speak now. He was going to kill her, and then he was going to kill Danny. Then maybe the hotel would be satisfied and allow him to kill himself. Just like that other caretaker. Just like Grady. With almost swooning horror, she realized at last who it was that Jack had been conversing with in the ballroom. You turned my son against me. That was the worst. His face sagged into lines of self-pity. My little boy. Now he hates me too. You saw to that. Oh, that was your plan all along, wasn't it? You've always been jealous, haven't you? Just like your mother. Oh, you couldn't be satisfied unless you had all the cake, could you? Could you? She couldn't talk. Well, I'll fix you, he said, and tried to put his hands around her throat. She took a step backward, then another, and he stumbled against her. She remembered the knife in the pocket of her robe and groped for it. But now his left arm had swept around her, pinning her arm against her side. She could smell sharp gin and the sour odor of his sweat. Have to be punished, he was grunting. Chastised, harshly. His right hand found her throat. As her breath stopped, pure panic took over. His left hand joined his right, and now the knife was free to her own hand, but she forgot about it. Both of her hands came up and began to yank helplessly at his larger, stronger ones. Mommy! Danny shrieked from somewhere. Daddy, stop! You're hurting Mommy! He screamed piercingly, a high and crystal sound that she heard from far off. Red flashes of light leaped in front of her eyes like ballet dancers. The room grew darker. She saw her son clamber up on the bar and throw himself at Jack's shoulders. Suddenly, one of the hands that had been crushing her throat was gone as Jack cuffed Danny away with a snarl. The boy fell back against the empty shelves and dropped to the floor, dazed. The hand was on her throat again. The red flashes began to turn black. Danny was crying weakly. Her chest was burning. Jack was shouting into her face. I'll fix you, God damn you. I'll show you who is boss around here. I'll show you. But all sounds were fading down a long, dark corridor. Her struggles began to weaken. One of her hands fell away from his and dropped slowly until the arm was stretched out at right angles to her body, the hand dangling limply from the wrist like the hand of a drowning woman. It touched a bottle, one of the straw-wrapped wine bottles that served as decorative candle holders. Sightlessly, with the last of her strength, she groped for the bottle's neck and found it, feeling the greasy beads of wax against her hand. And oh God, if it slips. She brought it up and then down, praying for aim, knowing that if it only struck his shoulder or upper arm, she was dead. But the bottle came down squarely on Jack Torrance's head, the glass shattering violently inside the straw. The base of it was thick and heavy, and it made a sound against his skull like a medicine ball dropped on a hardwood floor. He rocked back on his heels, his eyes rolling up in their sockets. The pressure on her throat loosened, then gave way entirely. He put his hands out, as if to steady himself, and then crashed over on his back. Wendy drew a long, sobbing breath. She almost felt herself fall, clutched the edge of the bar, and managed to hold herself up. Consciousness wavered in and out. She could hear Danny crying, but she had no idea where he was. It sounded like crying in an echo chamber. Dimly she saw dime-sized drops of blood falling to the dark surface of the bar. From her nose, she thought. She cleared her throat and spat on the floor. It sent a wave of agony up the column of her throat, but the agony subsided to a steady, dull press of pain, just bearable. Little by little, she managed to get control of herself. She let go of the bar, turned around, and saw Jack lying full length, the shattered bottle beside him. He looked like a felled giant. Danny was crouched below the lounge's cash register, both hands in his mouth, staring at his unconscious father. Wendy went to him unsteadily and touched his shoulder. Danny cringed away from her.
Danny, listen to me.
No, no, he muttered in a husky old man's voice. Daddy hurt you. You hurt Daddy. Daddy hurt you. I want to go to sleep. Daddy wants to go to sleep. Daddy, sleep, sleep, nighty-night. No. Pain ripping up her throat again. She winced against it. But he opened his eyes. They looked at her warily from bluish, shadowed sockets. She made herself speak calmly, her eyes never leaving his. Her voice was low and husky, almost a whisper. It hurt to talk. Listen to me, Danny. It wasn't your daddy trying to hurt me, and I didn't want to hurt him. The hotel has gotten into him, Danny. The Overlook has gotten into your daddy. Do you understand me? Some kind of knowledge came slowly back into Danny's eyes. The bad stuff, he whispered. There was none of it here before, was there? No, the hotel put it here. She broke off in a fit of coughing and spat out more blood. Her throat already felt puffed to twice its size. The hotel made him drink it. Did you hear those people he was talking to this morning? Yes, the hotel people. I heard them too. And that means the hotel's getting stronger. It wants to hurt all of us. But I hope that it can only do that through your daddy. He was the only one it could catch. Are you understanding me, Danny? It's desperately important that you understand. The hotel caught Daddy. He looked at Jack and groaned helplessly. I know you love your daddy. I do too. We have to remember that the hotel is trying to hurt him as much as it is us. And she was convinced that this was true. More, she thought that Danny might be the one the hotel really wanted, the reason it was going so far, maybe the reason it was able to go so far. It might even be that in some unknown fashion it was Danny's shine that was powering it, the way a battery powers the electrical equipment in a car, the way a battery gets a car to start. If they got out of here, the Overlook might subside to its old semi-sentient state, able to do no more than present penny dreadful horror slides to the more physically aware or psychically aware guests who entered it. Without Danny, it was not much more than an amusement park haunted house, where a guest or two might hear rappings or the phantom sounds of a masquerade party, or see an occasional disturbing thing. But if it absorbed Danny's shine or life force or spirit, whatever you wanted to call it, into itself, what would it be then? The thought made her cold all over. I wish Daddy was all better, Danny said, and the tears began to flow again. Me too, she said, and hugged Danny tightly. And honey, that's why you've got to help me put your daddy somewhere. Somewhere that the hotel can't make him hurt us, and where he can't hurt himself. Then, if your friend Dick comes, or a park ranger, we can take him away, and I think he might be all right again. All of us might be all right. I think there's still a chance for that if we're strong and brave. Like you were when you jumped on his back. Do you understand? She looked at him pleadingly and thought how strange it was. She had never seen him when he looked so much like Jack. Yes, he said and nodded. I think if we can get away from here, everything will be like it was. Where could we put him? The pantry. There's food in there, and a good strong bolt on the outside. It's warm,
And we can eat up the things from the refrigerator and the freezer. There'll be plenty for all three of us until help comes. Well, do we do it now? Yes, right now, before he wakes up.
Danny put the bar gate up while she folded Jack's hands on his chest and listened to his breathing for a moment. It was slow but regular. From the smell of him, she thought he must have drunk a great deal, and he was out of the habit. She thought it might be liquor as much as the crack on the head with the bottle that had put him out. Okay. She picked up his legs and began to drag him along the floor. She had been married to him for nearly 7 years. He had laid on top of her countless times, in the thousands. But she had never realized how heavy he was. Her breath whistled painfully in and out of her hurt throat. Nevertheless, she felt better than she had in days. She was alive. Having just brushed so close to death, that was precious. And Jack was alive too. By blind luck rather than plan, they had perhaps found the only way that would bring them all safely out. Panting harshly, she paused a moment, holding Jack's feet against her hips. The surroundings reminded her of the old seafaring captain's cry in Treasure Island after old Blind Pew had passed him the black spot. "We'll do him yet." And then she remembered uncomfortably that the old sea dog had dropped dead mere seconds later.
Are you all right, Mommy? Is he too heavy? I'll manage.
She began to drag him again. Danny was beside Jack. One of his hands had fallen off his chest, and Danny replaced it gently with love.
Are you sure, Mommy? Yes, it's the best thing, Danny. It's like putting him in jail. Only for a little while. Okay, then. Are you sure you can do it? Yes.
But it was a near thing at that. Danny had been cradling his father's head when they went over the door sills, but his hand slipped in Jack's greasy hair as they went into the kitchen. The back of his head struck the tiles, and Jack began to moan and stir. "Gotta use smoke," Jack muttered quickly. "Now run and give me that gas can." Wendy and Danny exchanged tight, fearful glances.
Help me,
she said in a low voice. For a moment Danny stood as if paralyzed by his father's face, and then he moved jerkily to her side and helped her hold the left leg. They dragged him across the kitchen floor in a nightmare kind of slow motion. The only sounds, the faint, insectile buzz of the fluorescent lights and their own labored breathing. When they reached the pantry, Wendy put Jack's feet down and turned to fumble with the bolt. Danny looked down at Jack, who was lying limp and relaxed again. The shirt tail had pulled out of the back of his pants as they dragged him, and Danny wondered if Daddy was too drunk to be cold. It seemed wrong to lock him in the pantry like a wild animal, but he had seen what he tried to do to Mommy. Even upstairs, he had known Daddy was going to do that. He had heard them arguing in his head. If only we could all be out of here. Or if it was a dream I was having back in Stovington. If only. The bolt was stuck. Wendy pulled at it as hard as she could, but it wouldn't move. She couldn't retract the goddamn bolt. It was stupid and unfair. She had opened it with no trouble at all when she had gone in to get a can of soup. Now it wouldn't move. And what was she going to do? They couldn't put him in the walk-in refrigerator. He would freeze or smother to death. But if they left him out and he woke up, Jack stirred again on the floor. "I'll take care of it. I understand."
He's waking up, Mommy.
Sobbing now, she yanked at the bolt with both hands.
Daddy.
There was something soft, menacing, if still blurry, in Jack's voice. "Danny, that you old duck."
Just go to sleep, Daddy.
Danny said nervously.
It's bedtime, you know.
He looked up at his mother, still struggling with the bolt, and saw what was wrong immediately. She had forgotten to rotate the bolt before trying to withdraw it. The little catch was stuck in its notch.
Here,
he said low, and brushed her trembling hands aside. His own were shaking almost as badly. He knocked the catch loose with the heel of his hand, and the bolt drew back easily.
Quick,
he said. He looked down. Jack's eyes had fluttered open again, and this time Daddy was looking directly at him, his gaze strangely flat and speculative. You copied it, Daddy told him. I know you did. But it's here somewhere. I'll find it. That I promise you I'll find it. His words slurred off again. Wendy pushed the pantry door open with her knee, hardly noticing the pungent odor of dried fruit that wafted out. She picked up Jack's feet again and dragged him in. She was gasping harshly now at the limit of her strength. As she yanked the chain pull that turned on the light, Jack's eyes fluttered open again. What are you doing? Wendy? What are you doing? She stepped over him. He was quick, amazingly quick. One hand lashed out, and she had to sidestep and nearly fall out the door to avoid his grasp. Still, he had caught a handful of her bathrobe, and there was a heavy purring noise as it ripped. He was up on his hands and knees now, his hair hanging in his eyes like some heavy animal, a large dog or lion. Damn you both! I know what you want. You're not going to get it. This hotel is mine. It's mine. It's me they want. Me. Me. The door, Danny, she screamed. Shut the door. He pushed the heavy wooden door shut with a slam, just as Jack leaped. The door latched, and Jack thudded uselessly against it. Danny's small hands groped at the bolt. Wendy was too far away to help. The issue of whether he would be locked in or free was going to be decided in 2 seconds. Danny missed his grip, found it again, and shot the bolt across just as the latch began to jiggle madly and down below it. Then it stayed up, and there was a series of thuds as Jack slammed his shoulder against the door. The bolt, a 1/4 inch of steel in diameter, showed no signs of loosening. Wendy let her breath out slowly. Let me out of here, Jack raged. Let me out! Daddy! Daddy, doggone it, this is your father. And I want to get out. Now do what I tell you! Danny's hand moved automatically toward the bolt. Wendy caught it and pressed it between her breasts. You mind your daddy, Daddy. You do what I say. You do it or I'll give you a hiding you'll never forget. Open this door or I'll bash your fucking brains in. Danny looked at her, pale as window glass. They could hear his breath tearing in and out behind the 1/2 inch of solid oak. Wendy, you let me out. Let me out right now. You cheap, nickel-plated, cold cunt bitch. You let me out. I mean it. You let me out of here and I'll let it go. If you don't, I'll mess you up. I'll mess you up so bad your own mother would pass you on the street. Now open this door! Danny moaned. Wendy looked at him and saw he was going to faint in a moment. Come on, Doc, she said, surprised at the calmness of her own voice. It's not your daddy talking, remember. It's the hotel. Come back here and let me out right now. There was a scraping, breaking sound as he attacked the inside of the door with his fingernails. It's the hotel, Danny said.
It's the hotel. I remember. But he looked back over his shoulder and his face was crumpled and terrified.
Chapter 47. Danny. It was 3 in the afternoon of a long, long day. They were sitting on the big bed in their quarters. Danny was turning the purple VW model with the monsters sticking out of the sunroof cover over and over in his hands compulsively. They had heard Daddy's batterings at the door all the way across the lobby. The batterings in his voice, hoarse and petulantly angry, in a weak king sort of way, vomiting promises of punishment, vomiting profanity, promising both of them that they would live to regret betraying him after he had slaved his guts out for them over the years. Danny thought they would no longer be able to hear it upstairs, but the sounds of his rage carried perfectly up the dumbwaiter shaft. Mommy's face was pale, and there were horrible brownish bruises on her neck where Daddy had tried to. He turned the model over and over in his hands, Daddy's prize for having learned his reading lessons, where Daddy had tried to hug her too tight. Mommy put some of her music on the little record player, scratchy and full of horns and flutes. She smiled at him tiredly. He tried to smile back and failed. Even with the volume turned up loud, he thought he could still hear Daddy screaming at them and battering the pantry door like an animal in a zoo cage. What if Daddy had to go to the bathroom? What would he do then? Danny began to cry. Wendy turned the volume down on the record player at once, held him, rocked him on her lap. Danny, it'll be all right. It'll be all right. If Mr. Halloran didn't get your message, someone else will. As soon as the storm is over. No one can get up here until then anyway. Mr. Halloran or anyone else. But when the storm's over, everything's going to be fine again. We'll leave here. And you know what we'll do next spring? 3 of us? Danny shook his head against her breasts. He did not know. It seemed that there would never be spring again. We'll go fishing. We'll rent a boat and go fishing, just like we did last year on Chatterton Lake. You and me and your daddy. And maybe you'll catch a bass for our supper, and maybe we won't catch anything, but we're sure to have a good time. I love you, Mommy, he said and hugged her. Oh, Danny, I love you too. Outside, the wind whooped and screamed. Around 4:30, just as the daylight began to fail, the screams ceased. They had both been dozing uneasily, Wendy still holding Danny in her arms, and she didn't wake. But Danny did. Somehow the silence was worse, more ominous than the screams and the blows against the strong pantry door. Was Daddy asleep again? Or dead? Or what? Did he get out? "15 minutes later, the silence was broken by a hard, grating metallic rattle. There was a heavy grinding, then a mechanical humming. Wendy came awake with a cry. The elevator was running again. They listened to it, wide-eyed, hugging each other. It went from floor to floor, the grate rattling back, the brass door slamming open. There was laughter, drunken shouts, occasional screams, and the sounds of breakage. The overlook was coming to life around them. Chapter 48. Jack. He sat on the floor of the pantry with his legs out in front of him, a box of Triscuit crackers between them, looking at the door. He was eating the crackers one by one, not tasting them, only eating them because he had to eat something. When he got out of here, he was going to need all his strength, all of his goddamn motherfucking strength. At this precise instant, he thought he had never felt quite so miserable in his entire fucking life. His mind and body together made up a large, writ scripture of pain. His head ached terribly, the sick throb of a hangover. The attendant symptoms were there, too. His mouth tasted like a manure rake had taken a swing through it. His ears rang. His heart had an extra heavy thudding beat like a tom-tom. In addition, both shoulders ached fiercely from throwing himself against the door, and his throat felt raw and peeled from useless shouting. He had cut his right hand on the door latch. And when he got out of here, he was going to kick some goddamn motherfucking ass. He munched the Triscuits one by one, refusing to give in to his wretched stomach, which wanted to vomit up everything. He thought of the Excedrin in his pocket and decided to wait until his stomach had quieted a bit. No sense swallowing a painkiller if you're going to throw it right back up. Have to use your brain, asshole. The celebrated Jack Torrance brain. Aren't you the fellow who once was going to live by his wits? Jack Torrance, best-selling author. Jack Torrance, acclaimed playwright and winner of the New York Critics Circle Award or some goddamn shit. John Torrance, man of letters, esteemed thinker, winner of the Pulitzer Prize at 70 for his trenchant book of memoirs, My Life in the 20th Century. All any of that shit boiled down to was living by your wits. Living by your wits is always knowing where the wasps are, and knowing how to fucking read. He put another Triscuit into his mouth and crunched it up. No one gave a shit, and they all hated him. What it really came down to, he supposed, was their lack of trust in him, their failure to believe that he knew what was best for them and how to get it. His wife had tried to usurp him, first by fair sort of means, then by foul. When her little hints and whining objections had been overturned by his own well-reasoned arguments, she had turned his boy against him, tried to kill him with a bottle, and then had locked him, of all places, in the goddamn fucking pantry. Still, a small interior voice nagged him. Yes, but where did the liquor come from? Isn't that really the central point? You know what happens when you drink. You know it from bitter experience. When you drink, you lose your wits. He hurled the box of Triscuits across the small room. They struck a shelf of canned goods and fell to the floor. He looked at the box, wiped his lips with his hand, and then looked at his watch. It was almost 6:30. He had been in here for hours. His wife had locked him in here, and he'd been here for fucking hours. He could begin to sympathize with his father. The thing he'd never asked himself, Jack realized now, was exactly what had driven his daddy to drink in the first place. And really, when you came right down to what his old students had been pleased to call the nitty-gritty, hadn't it been down to the woman he was married to? A milksop sponge of a woman, always dragging silently around the house with an expression of doomed martyrdom on her face. A ball and chain around Daddy's ankle. No, not ball and chain. She had never actively tried to make Daddy a prisoner the way Wendy had done to him. For Jack's father, it must have been more like the fate of McTeague, the dentist at the end of Frank Norris's great novel, handcuffed to a dead man in the wasteland. Yes, that was better. Mentally and spiritually dead. His mother had been handcuffed to his father by matrimony. Still, Daddy had tried to do right as he dragged her rotting corpse through life. He had tried to bring the 4 children up to know right from wrong, to understand discipline, and above all to respect their father. Well, they had been ingrates, all of them, himself included. And now he was paying the price. His own son had turned out to be an ingrate too. But there was hope. He would get out of here somehow. He would chastise them both, and harshly. He would set Danny on fire. He would set Danny an example, so that the day might come when Danny would know what to do better than he himself had known. He remembered the Sunday dinner when his father had caned his mother at the table. How horrified he and the others had been. Now he could see how necessary that had been. How his father had only been feigning drunkenness. How his wits had been sharp and alive underneath all along, watching for the slightest sign of disrespect. Jack crawled after the Triscuits and began to eat them again, sitting by the door she had so treacherously bolted. He wondered exactly what his father had seen, and how he had caught her out by his play acting. Had she been sneering at him behind her hand, sticking her tongue out, making obscene finger gestures, or only looking at him insolently and arrogantly, convinced that he was too stupidly drunk to see? Whatever it had been, he had caught her at it, and he had chastised her sharply. And now, 20 years later, he could finally appreciate Daddy's wisdom. Of course, you could say Daddy had been foolish to marry such a woman, to have handcuffed himself to that corpse in the first place, and a disrespectful corpse at that. But when the young marry in haste, they must repent in leisure. And perhaps Daddy's daddy had married the same type of woman. So then unconsciously Jack's daddy had also married one as Jack himself had. Except that his wife, instead of being satisfied with the passive role of having wrecked one career and crippled another, had opted for the poisonously active task of trying to destroy his last and best chance, to become a member of the Overlook staff, and possibly to rise all the way to the position of manager in time. She was trying to deny him Danny, and Danny was his ticket of admission. That was foolish, of course. Why would they want the son when they could have the father? But employers often had foolish ideas, and that was a condition that had been made. He wasn't going to be able to reason with her. He could see that now. He had tried to reason with her in the Colorado Lounge, and she had refused to listen, had hit him over the head with a bottle for his pains. But there would be another time, and soon he would get out of here. He suddenly held his breath and cocked his head. Somewhere a piano was playing Boogie Woogie. People were laughing, clapping along. The sound was muffled through the heavy wooden door, but audible. The song was, "There'll be a hot time in the old town tonight." his hands curled helplessly into fists. He had to restrain himself from battering at the door with them. The party had begun again. The liquor would be flowing freely. Somewhere, dancing with someone else, would be the girl who had felt so maddeningly nude under her white silk gown. You'll pay for this. God damn you two, you will pay. You will take your goddamn medicine for this. I promise you. You. Here now, a mild voice said just outside the door. No need to shout, old fellow. I can hear you perfectly well. Jack lurched to his feet. Grady? Is that you?
Yes, sir. Indeed it is. You appear to be locked. I'll come in again. You appear to have been locked in.
Let me out, Grady. Let me out now.
I see you can hardly have taken care of the business we discussed, sir. The correction of your wife and son.
Well, they're the ones who locked me in. Pull the bolt, for God's sake.
You let them lock you in?
Grady's voice registered well-bred surprise.
Oh dear. A woman half your size and a little boy. Hardly sets you off as being of top managerial timber, does it?
A pulse began to beat in the clock spring of veins at Jack's right temple. Let me out, Grady. I'll take care of them.
Will you indeed, sir? I wonder.
Well-bred surprise was replaced by well-bred regret.
I'm pained to say that I doubt it. I and others have really come to believe that your heart is not in this, sir. That you haven't the belly for it.
I do. I swear it.
Would you bring us your son?
Yes, I'll bring you your son. Or mine. I'll bring you all of our sons. We'll have a big old bonfire.
Your wife would object to that very strongly, Mr. Torrance. And she appears to be somewhat stronger than we had imagined. Somewhat more resourceful. She certainly seems to have gotten the better of you. Grady tittered. Perhaps, Mr. Torrance, we should have been dealing with her all along.
I'll bring him. I swear it.
His face was against the door now. He was sweating.
She won't object. I swear she won't. She won't be able to.
You would have to kill her, I fear.
I'll do what I have to do. Just let me out.
You'll give your word on it, sir.
My word, my promise, my sacred vow, whatever in hell you want. There was a flat snap as the bolt was drawn back. The door shivered open a quarter of an inch. Jack's words and breath halted. For a moment he felt that death itself was outside that door. The feeling passed. He whispered, "Thank you, Grady. I swear you won't regret it. I swear you won't." There was no answer. He became aware that all sounds had stopped except for the cold swooping of the wind outside. He pushed the pantry door open. The hinges squealed faintly. The kitchen was empty. Grady was gone. Everything was still and frozen beneath the cold white glare of the fluorescent bars. His eyes caught on the large chopping block where the three of them had eaten their meals. Standing on top of it was a martini glass, a fifth of gin, and a plastic dish filled with olives. Leaning against it was one of the roque mallets from the equipment shed. He looked at it for a long time. Then a voice much deeper and much more powerful than Grady's spoke from somewhere, everywhere, and from inside him. "Keep your promise, Mr. Torrance." "I will." He heard the fawning servility in his own voice, but was unable to control it. "I will." He walked to the chopping block and put his hand on the handle of the mallet. He hefted it, swung it. It hissed viciously through the air. Jack Torrance began to smile. Chapter 49. Halloran going up the country. It was 1:45 in the afternoon, and according to the snow-clouded signs in the Hertz Buick's odometer, he was less than 3 miles from Estes Park when he finally went off the road. In the hills, the snow was falling faster and more furiously than Halloran had ever seen, which was perhaps not to say a great deal, since Halloran had seen as little snow as he could manage in his lifetime. And the wind was blowing a capricious gale. Now from the west, now backing around to the north, sending clouds of powdery snow across the field of vision, making him coldly aware again and again that if he missed a turn, he might well plunge 200 feet off the road, the Electra cartwheeling ass over Teapot as it went down. Making it worse was his own amateur status as a winter driver. It scared him to have the little yellow center line buried under swirling, drifting snow, and it scared him when the heavy gusts of wind came unimpeded through the notches in the hills and actually made the heavy Buick slew around. It scared him that the road information signs were mostly masked with snow, and you could flip a coin as to whether the road was going to break right or left up ahead in the white drive-in movie screen he seemed to be driving through. He was scared, all right. He had driven in a cold sweat since climbing into the hills west of Boulder and Lyons, handling the accelerator and brake as if they were Ming faces. Between rock and roll tunes on the radio, the disc jockey constantly adjured motorists to stay off the main highways and under no conditions to go into the mountains, because many roads were impassable and all of them were dangerous. Scores of minor accidents have been reported, and 2 serious ones, a party of skiers in a VW microbus and a family that had been bound for Albuquerque through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The combined score on both was 4 dead and 5 wounded. So stay off those roads and get into the good music here at KTLK. The jock concluded cheerily, and then compounded Halloran's misery by playing Seasons in the Sun. We had joy, we had fun, we had Terry Jacks gibbered happily. Halloran snapped the radio off viciously, knowing he would have it back on in 5 minutes. No matter how bad it was better than riding alone through this white madness. Admit it. Some racist crap. Okay. It wasn't even funny. He would have backed off before he even cleared Boulder if it hadn't been for his compulsion that the boy was in terrible trouble. Even now, a small voice in the back of his skull, more the voice of reason than of cowardice, he thought was telling him to hole up in an Estes Park motel for the night and wait for the plows to at least expose the center stripe again. That voice kept reminding him of the jet's shaky landing at Stapleton, of that sinking feeling that was going to come in nose first, delivering its passengers to the gates of hell rather than Gate 39, Concourse B. But reason would not stand against the compulsion. It had to be okay. It had to be today. The snowstorm was his own bad luck. He would have to cope with it. He was afraid that if he didn't, he might have something much worse to cope with in his dreams. The wind gusted again, this time from the northeast. A little English on the ball, if you please. And he was again cut off from the vague shapes of the hills and even from the embankments on either side of the road. He was driving through White Knoll. And then the high sodium lights of the snowplow loomed out of the soup, bearing down, and to his horror, he saw that instead of being to one side, the Buick's nose was pointed directly between those headlamps. The plow was being none too choosy about keeping its own side of the road, and Halloran had allowed the Buick to drift. The grinding roar of the plow's diesel engine intruded over the bellow of the wind, and then the sound of its air horn, hard, long, almost deafening. Halloran's testicles turned into two small wrinkled sacks filled with shaved ice. His guts seemed to have been transformed into a large mass of silly putty. Color was materializing out of the white now, snow-clotted orange. He could see the high cab, even the gesticulating figure of the driver behind the single long wiper blade. He could see the V-shape of the plow's wing blades, spewing more snow up onto the road's left-hand embankment like pallid smoking exhaust. The air horn bellowed indignantly. He squeezed the accelerator like the breast of a much-loved woman, and the Buick scooted forward and toward the right. There was no embankment over here. The plows headed up instead of down, had only to push the snow directly over the drop. The drop. Ah, yes, the drop. The wing blades on Halloran's left, fully 4 feet higher than the Electra's roof, flirted by with no more than an inch or two to spare, until the plow had actually cleared him. Halloran had thought a crash inevitable, a prayer which was half an inarticulate apology to the boy flitted through his mind like a torn rag. Then the plow was past, his revolving blue lights glinting and flashing in Halloran's rearview mirror. He jockeyed the Buick's steering wheel back to the left, but nothing doing. The scoot had turned into a skid, and the Buick was floating dreamily toward the lip of the drop, spuming snow from under its mudguards. He flicked the wheel back the other way in the skid's direction, and the car's front and rear began to swap places. Panicked now, he pumped the brake hard, and then felt a hard bump. In front of him, the road was gone. He was looking into a bottomless chasm of swirling snow and vague greenish-gray pines far away and far below. I'm going, Holy Mother of Jesus, I'm going off. And that was where the car stopped, canting forward at a 30-degree angle, the left fender jammed against a guardrail, the rear wheels nearly off the ground. When Halloran tried reverse, the wheels only spun helplessly. His heart was doing a Gene Krupa drum roll. He got out. Very carefully he got out, and went around the Buick's back deck. He was standing there, looking at the back wheels helplessly, when a cheerful voice behind him said, "Hello there, fella. You must be shit right out of your mind." He turned around and saw the plow 40 yards further down the road, obscured in the blowing snow except for the raftered dark brown streak of its exhaust and the revolving blue lights on top. The driver was standing just below him, behind him, dressed in a long sheepskin coat and a slicker over it. A blue and white pinstriped engineer's cap was perched on his head, and Halloran could hardly believe it was staying on in the teeth of the wind. Glue. It sure God must be glue. "Hi," he said. "Can you pull me back onto the road?"
"Oh, I guess I could,"
the plow driver said.
"What the hell you doing up here, mister? Good way to kill your ass."
"Urgent business,"
"Well, nothing's that urgent."
the plow driver said slowly and kindly, as if speaking to a mental defective.
If you'd hit that post a leetle mite harder, nobody woulda got you out till All Fool's Day. Don't come from these parts, do you?"
No. And I wouldn't be here unless my business was as urgent as I say."
"That's so."
The driver shifted his stance companionably, as if they were having a desultory chat on the back steps instead of standing in a blizzard halfway between Hoot and Holler, with Halloran's car balanced 300 feet above the tops of the trees below.
"Where are you headed, Estes?"
No, a place called the Overlook Hotel," Halloran said. "It's a little way above Sidewinder." But the driver was shaking his head dolefully.
"I guess I know well enough where that is. Mister, you'll never get up to that old Overlook. Roads between Estes Park and Sidewinder is bloody damn hell. It's drifting in right behind us no matter how hard we push. I come through drifts a few miles back, and I was damn near 6 feet through the middle. And even if you can make Sidewinder, why, the road's closed from there all the way across to Buckland, Utah. Nope.
He shook his head.
Never make it, mister. Never make it at all."
"Well, I gotta try," Halloran said, calling on his last reserves of patience to keep his voice normal. "There's a boy up there."
"Boy? No. The Overlook closes down at the last end of September. No percentage keeping it open longer. Not too many shitstorms like this."
"He's the son of the caretaker. He's in trouble."
"How would you know that?"
His patient snapped. "For Christ's sake, are you gonna stand there and flap your jaw at me the rest of the day?" I know. Now are you gonna pull me back on the road or not?"
"Kinda testy, aren't you?"
the driver observed, not particularly perturbed.
"Sure. Get back in there. I got a chain behind the seat, huh?"
Halloran got back behind the wheel, beginning to shake with delayed reaction now. His hands were numbed, almost clear through. He'd forgotten to bring gloves. The plow backed up to the rear of the Buick, and he saw the driver get out with a long coil of chain. Halloran opened the door and shouted, "What can I do to help?"
"Well, stay out of the way is all,"
the driver shouted back.
"This isn't going to take a blink."
Which was true. A shudder ran through the Buick's frame as the chain pulled tight, and a second later he was back on the road, pointed more or less toward Estes Park. The plow driver walked up beside the window and knocked on the safety glass. Halloran rolled down the window. "Thanks," he said. "I'm sorry I shouted at you."
"Oh, I've been shouted at before,"
the driver said with a grin.
"I guess you're sort of strung up. Oh, you take these."
A pair of bulky blue mittens dropped into Halloran's lap.
"You'll need 'em when you go off the road again, I guess. Cold out. You wear 'em unless you want to spend the rest of your life picking your nose with a crocheting hook. And you send 'em back. My wife knitted 'em and I'm partial to 'em. Name and address is sewn right into the lining. I'm Howard Cottrell. Cottrell. By the way, you just send 'em back when you don't need 'em anymore. And I don't want to have to go paying no postage due of mine."
"All right," Halloran said, tired of this guy. "Thanks, one hell of a lot."
"You be careful. I'd take you myself, but I'm busy as a cat in a mess of guitar strings."
That's okay. Thanks again." He started to roll up the window, but Cottrell stopped him.
"When you get to Sidewinder, if you get to Sidewinder, you go to Durkin's Conoco. Well, it's right next to the library. Can't miss it. Well, you ask for Larry Durkin. Tell him Howie Cottrell sent you and you want to rent one of his snowmobiles. You mention my name and show those mittens. you'll get the cut rate, or you'll think you murdered me.
Thanks again, Halloran said. Cottrell nodded.
Oh, it's funny. Ain't no way you could know someone's in trouble up here at the Overlook. The phone's out sure as hell, but I believe you. Sometimes I get feelings.
Halloran nodded. Sometimes I do, too.
Yeah, I know you do. But you take care.
I will. Cottrell disappeared into the blowing dimness with a final wave, his engineer cap still mounted perkily on his head between his ears. Halloran got going again, the chains flailing at the snow cover on the road, finally digging in enough to start the Buicks moving. Behind him, Howard Cottrell gave a final good luck blast on his plow's air horn, although it was really unnecessary. Halloran could feel him wishing him good luck. That's 2 shines in one day, he thought, and that ought to be some kind of good omen. But he distrusted omens, good or bad. And meeting 2 people with the shine in one day, well, he might have been in a Stephen King book, when he usually didn't run across more than 4 or 5 in the course of a year, might not mean anything. Well, that feeling of finality, a feeling like things are all wrapped up, he could not completely define, was still very much with him. It was... The Buick wanted to skid sideways around a tight curve, and Halloran jockeyed it carefully, hardly daring to breathe. He turned on the radio again, and it was Aretha, and Aretha was just fine. He'd share his Hertz Buick with her any day. Another gust of wind struck the car, making it rock and slip around. Halloran cursed it and hunched more closely over the wheel. Aretha finished her song, and then the jock was on again, telling him that driving today was a good way to get killed. Halloran snapped the radio back off. He did make it to Sidewinder, although he was 4.5 hours on the road between Estes Park and there. By the time he got to the upland highway, it was full dark. No stars. But the snowstorm showed no sign of abating. Twice he'd had to stop in front of drifts that were as high as his car's hood and wait for the plows to come along and knock holes in them. At one of the drifts, the plow had come up on his side of the road, and there had been another close call. The driver had merely swung around his car, not getting out to chew the fat, but he did deliver one of the 2-finger gestures that all Americans above the age of 10 recognize. 2-finger. And it was not the peace sign. Oh, okay. It seemed that as he drew closer to the Overlook, his need to hurry became more and more compulsive. He found himself glancing at his wristwatch almost constantly. The hands seemed to be flying along. 10 minutes after he had turned into the upland, he passed 2 signs. The whipping wind had cleared both of their snowpack, so he was able to read them. Sidewinder 10, the first said. The second, road closed 12 miles ahead during winter months. Larry Durkin, Halloran muttered to himself. His face was strained and tense in the muted green glow of the dashboard instruments. It was 10 after 6. Conoco by the library. Larry. And that was when it struck him full force, the smell of oranges and the thought force heavy and hateful, murderous. Get out of here, you... God damn it, Stephen! This is none of your business. Okay. Evil voice. Evil racist voice. In head. Got it. Halloran screamed in the close confines of the car. The message did not come to him in words, but in a series of rebus-like images that were slammed into his head with terrific force. He took his hands from the steering wheel to blot the pictures out. Then the car smashed broadside into one of the embankments, rebounded, slewed halfway around, and came to a stop. The rear wheels spun uselessly. Halloran snapped the gear shift into park and then covered his face with his hands. He did not precisely cry. I'd understand if you skipped this whole part in the reading, because this is an awful gap. What escaped him was an uneven ha-ha-ha sound. His chest heaved. He knew that if that blast had taken him on a stretch of road with a drop-off from one side or the other, he might as well be dead now. Maybe that had been the idea, and it might hit him again at any time. He would have to protect against it. He was surrounded by a red force of immense power that might have been memory. He was drowning in instinct. He took his hands away from his face and opened his eyes cautiously. Nothing. If there was something trying to scare him again, it wasn't getting through. He was closed off. Had that happened to the boy? Dear God, had that happened to the little boy? And of all the images, the one that bothered him most was the dull whacking sound, like a hammer splatting into thick cheese. What did that mean? Jesus, not the little boy. Jesus, please. He dropped the gear shift lever into low range and fed the engine gas a little at a time. The wheels spun, and caught again. The Buick began to move, its headlights cutting weakly through the swirling snow. He looked at his watch, almost 6:30 now, and he was beginning to feel that was very late indeed. Chapter 50. Red Rum. Wendy Torrance stood indecisively in the middle of the bedroom, looking at her son, who had fallen fast asleep. Half an hour ago, the sounds had ceased. All of them, all at once. The elevator, the party, the sound of room doors opening and closing. Instead of easing her mind, it made the tension that had been building in her even worse. It was like a malefic hush before the storm's final brutal push. Malefic. But Danny had dozed off almost at once. First into a light twitching doze, and in the last 10 minutes or so a heavier sleep. Even looking directly at him, she could barely see the slow rise and fall of his narrow chest. She wondered when he had last gotten a full night's sleep, one without tormenting dreams or long periods of dark wakefulness, listening to revels that had only become audible and visible to her in the last couple of days as the Overlook's grip on the three of them tightened. Real psychic phenomena or group hypnosis? She didn't know, and didn't think it mattered. What had been happening was just as deadly either way. She looked at Danny and thought, God grant he lie still. That if he was undisturbed, he might sleep the rest of the night through. Whatever talent he had, he was still a small boy, and he needed the rest. It was Jack she had begun to worry about. She grimaced with sudden pain, took her hand away from her mouth, and saw she had torn off one of her fingernails. And her nails were one thing she'd always tried to keep nice. They weren't long enough to be called hooks, but still nicely shaped. And what are you worrying about your fingernails for? She laughed a little, but it was a shaky sound without amusement. First, Jack had stopped howling and battering at the door. Then the party had begun again. Or did it ever stop? Did it sometimes just drift into a slightly different angle of time, where they weren't meant to hear it? Counterpointed by the crashing, banging elevator. Then that had stopped. In that new silence, as Danny had been falling asleep, she had fancied she heard low, conspiratorial voices coming from the kitchen almost directly below them. At first she had dismissed it as the wind, which could mimic many different human vocal ranges, from a papery deathbed whisper around the doors and window frames to a full-out scream around the eaves. The sound of a woman fleeing a murderer in a cheap melodrama. Yet sitting stiffly beside Danny, the idea that it was indeed voices became more and more convincing. Jack and someone else discussing his escape from the pantry. discussing the murder of his wife and son. It would be nothing new inside these walls. Murder had been done here before. She had gone to the heating vent and had placed her ear against it, but at that exact moment the furnace had come on, and any sound was lost in the rush of warm air coming up from the basement. When the furnace had kicked off again, 5 minutes ago, the place was completely silent except for the wind, the gritty spatter of snow against the building, and the occasional groan of a board. She looked down at her ripped fingernail. Small beads of blood were oozing up from behind it. Jack's gotten out. Don't talk nonsense. Yes, he's out. He's gotten a knife from that kitchen and maybe the meat cleaver. He's on his way up here right now, walking along the sides of the risers so the stairs won't creak. You're insane. Her lips were trembling, and for a moment it seemed that she must have cried the words out loud, but silence held. She felt watched. She whirled around and stared at the night-blackened window, and a hideous white face with circles of darkness for eyes was gibbering in at her. The face of a monstrous lunatic that had been hiding in these groaning walls all along. It was only a pattern of frost on the outside of the glass. She let her breath out in a long, susurrating whisper of fear, and it seemed to her that she heard quite clearly this time amused titters from somewhere. You're jumping at shadows. It's bad enough without that. By tomorrow morning, you'll be ready for the rubber room. There was only one way to allay those fears, and she knew what it was. She would have to go down and make sure Jack was still in the pantry. Very simple. Go downstairs, have a peek, come back up. Oh, by the way, stop and grab the tray on the registration counter. The omelet would be a washout, but the soup could be reheated on the hot plate by Jack's typewriter. Oh yeah, don't get killed if he's down there with a knife. She walked to the dresser, trying to shake off the mantle of fear that lay on her. Scattered across the dresser's top was a pile of change, a stack of gasoline chits for the hotel truck, the 2 pipes Jack brought with him everywhere but rarely smoked, and his key ring. She picked it up, held it in her hand for a moment, and then put it back down. The idea of locking the bedroom door behind her had occurred, but it just didn't appeal. Danny was asleep. Vague thoughts of fire passed through her mind. Something else nibbled more strongly, but she let go. Wendy crossed the room, stood indecisively by the door for a moment, then took the knife from the pocket of her robe and curled her right hand around the wooden haft. She pulled the door open. The short corridor leading to their quarters was bare. The electric wall flambeaux all shone brightly at their regular intervals, showing off the rug's blue background and sinuous weaving pattern. See? No boogies here. No, of course not. They want you out. They want you to do something silly and womanish. And that is exactly what you are doing. She hesitated again, miserably caught, not wanting to leave Danny in the safety of the apartment, and at the same time needing badly to reassure herself that Jack was still safely packed away. Of course he is. But the voices. There were no voices. It was your imagination. It was the wind. It wasn't the wind. The sound of her own voice made her jump, but the deadly certainty in it made her go forward. The knife swung by her side, catching angles of light and throwing them on the silk wallpaper. Her slippers whispered against the carpet's nap. Her knives Her nerves were singing like wires. She reached the corner of the main corridor and peered around. Her mind stiffened for whatever she might see there. There was nothing to see. After a moment's hesitation, she rounded the corner and began to go down the main corridor. Each step toward the shadowy stairwell increased her dread and made her aware that she was leaving her sleeping son behind, alone and unprotected. The sound of her slippers against the carpet seemed louder and louder in her ears. Twice she looked back over her shoulder to convince herself that someone was not creeping up behind her. She reached the stairwell and put her hand on the cold newel post at the top of the railing. There were 19 wide steps down to the lobby. She had counted them enough times to know. 19 carpeted stair risers, and nary a Jack crouching on one of them. Of course not. Jack was locked in the pantry behind a hefty steel bolt and a thick wooden door. But the lobby was dark, and oh so full of shadows. Her pulse thudded steadily and deeply in her throat. Ahead and slightly to the left, the brass yaw of the elevator stood mockingly open, inviting her to step in and take the ride of her life. No, thank you. The inside of the car had been draped with pink and white crepe streamers. Creepy streamers. Confetti had burst from 2 tubular party favors. Lying in the rear left corner was an empty bottle of champagne. She sensed movement above her and wheeled to look up the 19 steps. 19 steps leading to the dark second-floor landing, and saw nothing. Yet there was a disturbing corner-of-the-eye sensation that things had leaped back into the deeper darkness of the hallway up there just before her eyes could register them. She looked down the stairs again. Her right hand was sweating against the wooden handle of the knife. She switched it to her left, wiped her right palm against the pink terry cloth of her robe, and switched the knife back, almost unaware that her mind had given her body the command to go forward. She began down the stairs, left foot then right, her free hand trailing lightly on the banister. Where's the party? Oh, don't let me scare you away, you bunch of moldy sheets. Not one scared woman with a knife. Let's have a little music around here. Let's have a little life. 10 steps down, a dozen, a baker's dozen. The light from the first-floor hall filtered a dull yellow down here, and she remembered that she would have to turn on the lobby lights either beside the entrance to the dining room or inside the manager's office. Yet there was light coming from somewhere else, white and muted. The fluorescents, of course. The fluorescents in the kitchen. She paused on the 13th step, trying to remember if she had turned them off or left them on when she and Danny left. Well, she simply couldn't remember. Below her, in the lobby, high-backed chairs hawked in pools of shadow. The glass in the lobby doors was pressed white with a uniform blanket of drifted snow. Brass studs in the sofa cushions gleamed faintly like cat's eyes. There were 100 places to hide. Her legs stilted with fear, she continued down. Now 17, now 18, now 19. Lobby level, madam. Step out carefully. The ballroom doors were thrown wide, only blackness spilling out. From within came a steady tickling, or a ticking, like a bomb. She stiffened, then remembered the clock on the mantel. The clock under glass. Jack or Danny must have wound it. Or maybe it had wound itself up, like everything else in the Overlook. Well, she turned down towards the reception desk, meaning to go through the gate in the manager's office and into the kitchen, gleaming dull silver.
She could see the intended lunch tray. Then the clock began to strike, little tinkling notes. Wendy stiffened, her tongue rising to the roof of her mouth. Then she relaxed. It was striking 8, that was all. 8 o'clock. 5, 6, 7. She counted the strokes. It suddenly seemed wrong to move again until the clock had stilled. 8, 9, 9, 10, 11. Suddenly, belatedly, it came to her. She turned back clumsily for the stairs, knowing already she was too late. But how could she have known? 12. All the lights in the ballroom went on. There was a huge shrieking flourish of brass. Wendy screamed aloud, the sound of her cry insignificant against the blare issuing from those brazen lungs.
Unmask!
The cry echoed.
Unmask! Unmask!
Then they faded, as if down a long corridor of time, leaving her alone again. No, not alone. She turned, and he was coming for her. It was Jack, and yet not Jack. His eyes were lit with a vacant, murderous glow. His familiar mouth now wore a quivering, joyless grin. He had the roque mallet in one hand. "Thought you'd lock me in? Is that what you thought you'd do?" The mallet whistled through the air. She stepped backward, tripped over a hassock, fell to the lobby rug.
Jack!
"You bitch," he whispered. "I know what you are." The mallet came down again with whistling, deadly velocity and buried itself in her soft stomach. She screamed, suddenly submerged in an ocean of pain. Dimly she saw the mallet rebound. It came to her with sudden numbing reality that he meant to beat her to death with the mallet he held in his hands. She tried to cry out to him again, to beg him to stop for Danny's sake, but her breath had been knocked loose. She could only force out a weak whimper, hardly a sound at all. Now, by Christ," he said, grinning. He kicked the hassock out of his way. "I guess you'll take your medicine now." The mallet whickered down. Wendy rolled to her left, her robe tangling above her knees. Jack's hold on the mallet was jarred loose when it hit the floor. He had to stop and pick it up, and while he did, she ran for the stairs, the breath at last sobbing back into her. Her stomach was a bruise of throbbing pain. "Bitch," he said through his grin, and began to come after her. "You stinking bitch. I guess you'll get what's coming to you. I guess you will." She heard the mallet whistle through the air, and then agony exploded on her right side as the mallet head took her just below the line of her breasts, breaking 2 ribs. She fell forward on the steps, and new agony ripped her as she struck on the wounded side. Yet instinct made her roll over, roll away, and the mallet whizzed past the side of her face, missing by a naked inch. It struck the deep pile of the stair carpeting with a muffled thud. That was when she saw the knife, which had been jarred out of her hand by her fall. It lay glittering on the 4th stair riser. "Bitch," he repeated. The mallet came down. She shoved herself upward, and it landed just below her kneecap. Her lower leg was suddenly on fire. Blood began to trickle down her calf. And then the mallet was coming down again. She jerked her head away from it, and it smashed into the stair riser in the hollow between her neck and shoulder.
scraping away the flesh from her ear. He brought the mallet down again, and this time she rolled toward him down the stairs, inside the arc of his swing. A shriek escaped her as her broken ribs thumped and grated. She struck his shins with her body while he was off balance, and he fell backward with a yell of anger and surprise, his feet jigging to keep their purchase on the stair riser. Then he thumped to the floor, the mallet flying from his hand. He sat up, staring at her for a moment with shocked eyes. "I'll kill you for that," he said. He rolled over and stretched out for the handle of the mallet. Wendy forced herself to her feet. Her left leg sent bolt after bolt of pain all the way up to her hip. Her face was ashy pale, but set. She leaped onto his back as his hand closed over the shaft of the roque mallet.
Oh, dear God!
She screamed to the overlook's shadowy lobby and buried the kitchen knife in his lower back up to the handle. He stiffened beneath her and then shrieked. She thought she had never heard such an awful sound in her whole life. It was as if the very boards and windows and doors of the hotel had screamed. It seemed to go on while he remained board stiff beneath her weight. They were like a parlor charade of horse and rider, except that the back of his red and black checked flannel shirt was growing darker, sodden, with spreading blood. Then he collapsed forward on his face, bucking her off on her hurt side, making her groan. She lay breathing harshly for a time, unable to move. She was an excruciating throb of pain from one end to the other. Every time she inhaled, something stabbed viciously at her, and her neck was wet with blood from her grazed ear. There was only the sound of her struggle to breathe, the wind, and the ticking clock in the ballroom. At last she forced herself to her feet and hobbled across to the stairway. When she got there, she clung to the newel post head down, waves of faintness washing over her. When it had passed a little, she began to climb, using her unhurt leg and pulling with her arms on the banister. Once she looked up, expecting to see Danny there, but the stairway was empty. Thank God he slept through it. Thank God, thank God. 6 steps up, she had to rest, her head down, her blonde hair coiled on and over the banister. Air whistled painfully through her throat, as if it had grown barbs. Her right side was a swollen hot mass. Come on, Wendy. Come on, old girl. Get a locked door behind you and then look at the damage. 13 more. 13 more to go, not so bad. And when you get to the upstairs corridor, you can crawl. I give my permission. She drew in as much breath as her broken ribs would allow and half pulled, half fell up another riser, and another. She was on the 9th, almost halfway up, when Jack's voice came from behind and below her. He said thickly, "You bitch. You killed me." Terror as black as midnight swept through her. She looked over her shoulder and saw Jack getting slowly to his feet. His back was bowed over, and she could see the handle of the kitchen knife sticking out of it. His eyes seemed to have contracted, almost to have lost themselves in the pale, sagging folds of the skin around them. He was grasping the roque mallet loosely in his left hand. The end of it was bloody. A scrap of her pink terrycloth robe stuck almost in the center. "I'll give you your medicine," he whispered, and began to stagger toward the stairs. Whimpering with fear, she began to pull herself upward again. 10 steps, a dozen, a baker's dozen, but still the first-floor hallway looked as far above her as an unattainable mountain peak. She was panting now, her sides shrieking in protest. Her hair swung wildly back and forth in front of her face. Sweat stung her eyes. The ticking of the domed clock in the ballroom seemed to fill her ears, and counterpointing it, Jack's panting, agonized breaths. Nope. And counterpointing it, Jack's panting, agonized gasps as he began to mount the stairs.